Hello, and welcome to Community Voices, where we talk to Humboldt County's movers and shakers. Today's guest, Katie Buesch, Director of the Clarke Historical Museum. And now here's your host, Paul Bressoud.
Hello and welcome to Access Humboldt's Community Voices. I'm your host, Paul Bressoud. My guest today, Director and Curator of North Coast Institution, the Clarke Museum, Katie Buesch. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And I always start out by asking people what their job actually entails. You're the Director and Curator of a museum. What is that?
It's a lot of different things. It's everything from putting together exhibits and researching items that are going into exhibits, just learning more in general about Humboldt County and Northwestern California's history. It's coordinating with my coworkers to do all sorts of projects that they're working on. As many people might know, we have a pretty significant collection of basketry and other important items from all up here in Northwestern California. So things like that, also finding new ways to engage with the public, which has been really big over the course of the pandemic, of course, trying to keep people engaged while they can't come into the museum. And, doing community events. We've done, we were able to successfully do a street fair recently, things like that. So it's a lot of different things, but it's a lot of just helping people get excited about local history.
Well, we'll talk about some of the pandemic challenges at the end. I went ahead and read your mission statement, and I was interested by this, the task of what this may be, to bring people the rich and varied history of Northwestern California. What does that mean, and what does that entail? How wide a scope does that encompass?
Well, it's a lot, but it's, there's just so many different, cultures and people from all over the country and all around the world that have lived in Northwestern California over, its very long history, pre-contact to now. So it's not only telling the stories that people already kind of know, but it's also questioning those stories, adding more detail to them, adding more voices to them, trying to figure out who's telling the story and whose voices would be beneficial to add in. People who have been traditionally left out of these narratives.
So now I read your bio and you said that you liked strange local historical stories. How do you go about picking these stories? And then to follow up on that, you can run on here. You have standing exhibits, or do you have changing exhibits? I mean, you're out there looking for stories. How do you incorporate them into the exhibits?
Yeah, so some of it is as straightforward as I might be driving down the street somewhere and see something and be, what's the story behind that? One example is up in Auric, there's a chunk of redwood on the side of the road that's kind of vaguely shoe-shaped, but it's actually supposed to be a peanut. It's the Auric Peanut. It was carved by some... Yeah, so this is a fun story. So, it was during the protests about expanding the Redwood National Park from its original size to its present day size. And there was a big, I want to say parade, but it wasn't really a parade, but it was a group of loggers from all up and down our coast here, all the way up into Washington State, that came together to protest the expansion of the national park due to things like losses of jobs and kind of the wholesale change of how the community was structured by the addition of the park. So they came together and they drove their logging trucks. Many of them had trees on them. There was a flatbed truck with the Auric Peanut. They drove it out to Washington, D.C. as part of a protest. And the idea was to give the peanut to Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time, the peanut farmer, you know.
Right.
And there was a sign that went with it that said, "It may be peanuts to you, but it's jobs to us."
Oh.
And Jimmy Carter didn't want the peanut, so his aides said, "No, you can take this back." So they drove it back to Auric, and now it sits on the side of the road. But it's stuff like that, or, you know, there's Humboldt County History's Facebook group page where people are always posting like pictures and all sorts of things. Like there was one that came up with a guy in Sequoia Park with a tricycle. I was like, okay, what's the deal with this guy? He also had a little cornet, which is kind of a little trumpet. So I looked more into that, and it was a guy named Court Edwards who lived in Eureka for a time, had a bicycle shop, and his kind of claim to fame was he was going to ride his unicycle across the U.S. This was a 30-pound unicycle with his little cornet, and he had a little buddy that went with him, who was on a regular bicycle. And of course, this is, early 1900s. So, you know, roads across the U.S. were not much more than dirt roads. So he was trying to ride his unicycle across. He eventually did make it, but he arrived on a motorcycle instead and became this motorcycle star before he died in a pretty intense crash when racing a motorcycle. At the time, it was a pretty hazardous sport. You'd be riding on these tracks. They were wooden tracks, but they could be at 45-degree angles in a big circle. So you'd be riding around really fast. But if anything happened, the motorcycles didn't have brakes, so you would just kind of fly up and out of the track. But all the spectators were sitting at the top of the track, so you could see how that could be an issue. But it's just stuff like that. And then here in the museum, the collections are pretty extensive. So as we're just kind of putting around doing different things, inventories and whatnot, we'll come across items and just kind of be like, okay, what is this? Why is this here? You know, and so we'll just research it, and, you know, it makes it into exhibits, or if we're working on an exhibit, we might find something interesting that, you know, we'll share the story of. So. Okay,
let me follow up on a couple of things that you said. First of all, and then we can put this one to bed, is there any, interest in getting the Auric Peanut and bringing it down and making it part of the museum?
It's, it's the size of a car, like an SUV. It's pretty big.
Somewhere for it, yeah, front or.
I mean, we joked about it here in the office about moving it into Clarke Plaza when we did our Redwood National Park exhibit, but to move the darn thing would be a whole thing in itself, you know, and it probably would barely fit in Clarke Plaza even if we could fit it in there. But
does it still have the plaque on it that they had, or the sign? Oh, that's
no. Yeah, it's just sitting on the side of the road, and I think there were questions by the people in Auric to put like a kind of a shelter over the top of it to protect it from the weather, but for one reason or another that never happened, so it's just kind of sitting out there now.
Okay, my other question is this fabulous story of the unicycle and the motorcycle racing, and this unique person that lived in Humboldt County. Let's take a story like that. And you say you like local, you know, stories of interest, kind of quirky stories. There you go. That one sounds perfect. How does that person fit into an exhibit?
So his name's Court Edwards. He hasn't shown up in an exhibit yet, but sometimes the museum has a blog. And so a lot of times when I'd come across these things, I'd kind of write about it in the blog. And then they've appeared in things like Senior News. They've appeared in the Humboldt Historian. I think there's an article that I wrote that includes him in it. I don't think it's been published yet, but it might be in the next couple quarters or whatnot. So, you know, but sometimes they don't always end up in exhibits, but they're still, you know, around in our social media and in our websites and things like that.
Let me ask that question. Is that a function of the museum to go ahead and send these stories to other historical publications so that people can connect with them?
It's not, I think in the past we haven't done it a lot, but more recently, just because like I've been doing research and whatnot, I've been wanting to share it with other people because they are so quirky, and it's a different way of engaging the public with history. Because a lot of times, like I know growing up, history was a lot of like, this guy fought that guy, and then there were these wars, and then just kind of people doing stuff. And you don't really hear a lot of this like individual, what was going on with this, regular person's life. So it is a different way to kind of focus in on, community members and things like that.
Sure, they never build it as the history of different, interesting, quirky, weird people come. I'd have taken that class for sure,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So when you talk about exhibits, do you have standing exhibits and then do you have rotating exhibits?
Yeah, so we have a couple of exhibit spaces here that are what would be called permanent exhibit spaces. So they're generally the same. One of them is the Victorian room. So it's set up in a way where it would look as if upper middle class person from the Victorian era was living in it. And then we have the weapons vault, which opened at the end of 2019 and houses the entire Clarke collection of weapons, which includes firearms, swords, knives, and like powder horns and related things like that. So both of those exhibits stay generally the same, but to encourage people to come back and learn more about, different aspects of the Victorian period, we have interns and volunteers that work on putting together exhibits in those spaces. So the Victorian room right now, we have an exhibit on mourning dresses. So after usually a woman's husband passed away, she'd go into mourning. So she might wear all black for a certain period of time and then transition to dark colors before finally just going back to what she'd usually wear. But also talking about how that was different based on what class you might be in. Like if you were a wealthy person, you could afford to change your entire wardrobe to black for, 6 months or whatnot. And then, have dark dresses and then go back to whatever's in style. And then in the weapons vault, so we've done one kind of temporary exhibit in there. So what we did was we had a way to kind of cover up the firearms and things in a safe way where they're still in the cases, but we're able to put things on display in front of them. Most recently, that was an exhibit called Pieces of Our Lives, which talked about local family members or local people who had family members who were sent to Japanese internment camps during World War II. So it had items that they had made in camp or brought with them when they had gotten out of camp.
And then you have a longstanding collection of Native American basketry and regalia that is at the museum. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so that's Niels Hall. Niels Hall was built in 1979. Through a collaboration with a local landowner and the city of Eureka, and some funding received from, it was the Economic Development Council, I think is what it was. But it was built specifically to house Cecile Clarke's Native American collections. She was really big into collecting items from Native tribes. A lot of times she would purchase items or people would send them to her for her exhibits. And yeah, I mean, some of the kind of big collections that we have in there are items from the Hover family. So the Hover family collection originally was a Karuk family of weavers that would weave baskets. They'd also get baskets from other people and incorporate them into their collections. At one point in time, that collection was housed at the hotel in Pequon, I think it was. And there was a fire, and to save the baskets, they threw the baskets out the window while the building was burning and were able to save the collection. But the last Hover family member to have the collection, I think her name was Elsie Hover, she was a teacher, so she would use the basket collection in her classes. And we have some pretty interesting pictures of her like putting baskets on different kids, like having them carry burden baskets or wear basket caps, which I thought was kind of interesting. But they ended up selling the collection to the museum to be used as an educational tool for the public. And that was in the 80s, I want to say. But then we also have different spaces in Niels Hall that rotate out. We're working right now on an exhibit with some interns on flint knapping and stone tools, which should be really cool. We have a scientific artist who is drawing out sketches of how flint knapping is done. So flint knapping is to create things like projectile points, also known as arrowheads, stone blades, things like that. That should be pretty cool. That'll be coming up in the new year. But we also have an exhibit right now on tobacco baskets and use of native tobacco plants by the tribes for ceremonial uses and things like that. And that's on loan from the Trinidad Museum. There's a guy up there named Ron Johnson who's done exhibits there and at the Clarke on various aspects of native traditions up here. So it's really outstanding.
So in order to have rotating exhibits come through, do you have to go ahead and connect and build partnerships with tribes or other museums, other historical societies? Is there kind of a network of loaning to exhibits that goes on?
So a lot of it is just kind of knowing the different museums and history organizations around. One thing that the Clarke kind of revived, I guess, would be back in 2019 is this group called the North Coast Museum Alliance. And that's us trying to get together all the different museums in our kind of area. So not only Humboldt County, but Del Norte, Mendocino, even inland, but trying to get these museum people to come together, meet each other, talk about what they're doing, share information. And with the pandemic, it's made it really hard to keep that group together. But through the connections, the Clarke has made with that group, I've been able to reach out to all these different museums to borrow things for exhibits or borrow whole exhibits themselves.
Can I ask real quick, how many museums are in the Alliance?
Oh man, it's been a while since I've done a head count. But I know that within Humboldt,
you can just say.
Within Humboldt County, there's about 35 history or history adjacent organizations. Many of them do have museums, some of them don't. But yeah, so not sure that really answers it, but.
And so then when you're talking about Del Norte County and the counties to the east, are you talking about 100 organizations that you go ahead and connect with?
I think on our little email list we have about 80 people. So yeah, that includes, let's see, it's the Trinity County Historical Society. We send emails out to them when there's stuff going on, but yeah.
That's cool. So now you mentioned during the pandemic, what are the outreach activities or efforts that you've had to make during the pandemic regarding, keeping a museum in the forefront or for people to have access to it?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot in terms of virtual outreach, like many other people have. So things like social media, we've always kind of had a social media presence, but we've really kicked it up a gear over the last year and a half. We're, sharing items from the collection on social media, like Facebook and Instagram. We're doing virtual programs. So we've done things like Jerry Rohde, who's a really popular local historian, came out and did a couple of programs with the Lentil map, which is this gigantic paper mache map we have out front of the museum here, where he'll just kind of stand there and, riff on this map for like an hour. And that's been a lot of fun to, bring these people together to do that. And like last year for the history symposium, it went virtual, and I toured around a bunch of the different history museums. So I went out to THA, Timber Heritage Association in Samoa, got to ride around in a locomotive, which was kind of cool. I wasn't expecting that. But, taking people behind the scenes at the Eureka Theater, the Historical Society, walking around with their archivist, Jim Garrison, who worked there last year. But it's been really interesting with the new kind of technologies we can use to bring spaces that you usually wouldn't get to see to the public through, live streams and things like that.
Have you reached out just researched yourself what other museums are doing as far as putting themselves out and making them accessible to the public?
Yeah, I'm on way too many listservs when it comes to seeing what other museums are up to. But yeah, that's something I do, and I encourage the rest of my staff to do, to see what other organizations are up to, not just here locally, but across the country as well.
I'd like to ask about the Chinese Expulsion project. Is that something new that's going on? Is that in the works? Is there an exhibit that's planned for that down the road?
Yeah, so that actually kind of started with an exhibit, which is kind of funny. But yeah, in 2019, someone came by the museum and dropped off a clay pot. And they're like, I feel weird about having this clay pot. It's been in my family for a while, but I think a museum should have it. And I was like, well, why do you feel weird about this clay pot? It's just a clay pot. And he said that he had a relative a couple generations back that had found it at the site of historic Chinatown. I was like, oh, there was a Chinatown here. He's like, oh, yeah. He didn't know where it was, I don't think. But he was like, yeah, there's a Chinatown, and it's just kind of weird to have this pot. So here you go. And that set me on a research adventure of figuring out where Chinatown was, why the expulsion happened, all of that stuff. And it came together in an article for the Humboldt Historian, but it also came together for an exhibit at the museum here, which opened February of 2020. So not too many people got to see it, unfortunately, even though it was up for most of the year. I did some virtual tours of it and stuff. So if people want to see it, that's one way to experience it. It's on the website. But yeah, there was someone that came by the museum and was like, I'm really interested in this Chinatown thing, and I kind of want to put, something to recognize where it was at. And I was like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. And then next thing I know, I got an email from that same person along with like 30 other people who were like, we're going to do something about Chinatown. And I was like, okay. And that's where the Eureka Chinatown project started, was just one person saying, I want to put a plaque up here to recognize that this place was here. And since then, we've had like 6 or 7 walking tours of Chinatown that has taken people out there to see where it was at, talk about the role it played in Humboldt County's history in building the place that we know today, and also the after effects of the expulsion in the local community. But it's also created a mural. So there's a giant mural featuring a duck in the center that is over there too. There's works for a monument to be put there as kind of a representative of, or in remembrance of the community that lived there. But there's also works right now to rename the street that runs through where Chinatown was, Charlie Moon Way, in recognition of Charlie Moon, who was widely touted as the last Chinese man in Humboldt County, which isn't necessarily true. But it makes for a really interesting title for someone. But also to recognize the people that, besides Charlie Moon, stayed behind, even when there were these numbers of Chinese expulsions happening, not only in Eureka, but Arcata, Fortuna, Ferndale, Port Kenyon, things like that. So,
is there any plans of bringing an exhibit back to the museum now that there's more access?
I've been getting that question a lot.
And there it is. Great.
Yeah. So I know right now we're working on doing kind of a mini exhibit at HSU's library to talk about the continuing research that's going on. We've uncovered a lot of stuff since the last exhibit happened. So there's going to be that exhibit. I think we're also going to try to bring it here as well. It won't take up the full main hall like it did previously, but I think we're going to do like a mini exhibit of it that'll have more information than we previously had. So we're working on it.
I'm going to ask you one last question before we sign off. Is research the most enjoyable part of your job?
Oh, it's a close tie between that and planning events, which is kind of funny because I know a lot of people that are like, oh, planning events, it's really difficult. But especially it all ends up Yeah, especially in a pandemic. But it all pays off when you're able to be at the event and just see the impact it's having on people. And just, getting people engaged with what's going on in local history.
Well, that's excellent. Well, thank you so much, Katie Buesch, for being on the show. And then, hopefully again sometime, no matter what's, no matter the time, it seems like it's always an exciting time to be working and researching local history for a museum, because there's always going to be some story that gets unearthed and brought to the public. So we appreciate your hard work for that. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank my guest, Katie Buesch, for being here, and thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next time on Community Voices.
This has been Community Voices with your host, Paul Bressoud. If you represent a nonprofit organization and are interested in being a guest on Community Voices, send an email to info@accesshumboldt.net or call 476-1798. Access Humboldt, local voices through community media.